Hello everybody, my name's Julie. I'm an architect. That always feels like a confession. This is the first time I've ever done a presentation like this. It's really strange. So this is the third time I've given this presentation. I gave once a RIBA talk, so if you might have seen that before for any of you. And then I give this as a lecture. I'm going to try and ram it into 15 minutes. I think I can go over a bit if I need to, so that's fine. People don't usually ask me any questions, so let's see if we can have some fun with this. Okay, so I'm an architect. Since 2007, I've been working with urban climatologists, trying to increase our awareness of the importance of built form as an energy management parameter. And by that, what we mean is energy, the building's own energy management, the influence that that form will have on its surrounding settings, and the impact that that building will have on access to passive resources. So the natural energy that occurs, ventilation and all that types of thing. And this topic has been overlooked in favour of a generic technology such as green roofs, photovoltaics and various things like that, which we can prove works a lot better if you consider the built form in its context. So this is what this study is about. We're going to be reporting on research that we've been doing over the last 5 years. Since 2014, yeah, 5 years. Is that too loud? Stop me at any time with a question, it's fine. Okay, back to this. So what are the issues? 50% of the global population live in urban environments. In the UK, it's about 85%, so we're already really high. 80% of 9 billion people by 2050, that's huge. So we have to get urban areas right. It occupies less than 3% of ice-free land. That's a variable. Depending on who you talk to, they'll come up with 1 or 2%. So it's a very small area. Yet we need a huge area to be able to supply that 2%. We produce 70% of the global CO2. We consume 2/3 of global energy. 50% is taken by buildings. 75%, I like this one, 75% of the UK building stock is for 2050 is already in place. That means that every single building that we build from now on really has to matter. It can no longer think about the building in itself in its own right, but we have to think about the impact of that building on the wider environment. How far does it go? How wide is the boundary of the building? How far does it extend beyond its envelope? We've got to reduce carbon by 80% by 2050, and UK urban temperatures are set to rise between 1.1 and 3.3 degrees C. Our current methodology is where we focus on the building envelope, renewables, and occupation, how people behave. And what we know about occupation is we don't know anything about how people behave. We can't predict how people are going to behave. So the building has to take a lot of responsibility. But all of this stuff focuses on the individual building. It doesn't look beyond the envelope. Anywhere in the world, we don't have to consider the impact of the building on the wider environment, although there are some arguments that we have to consider its microclimate, but that's very minimal. We're nowhere near as good as we need to be with that. And we know from the work that we do, which is in the City of London, we're working with the City of London, we know that shading increases heating loads. Nobody takes that into account. We know that shading reduces cooling loads. Nobody takes that into account. We know that shading reduces photovoltaic productivity. We don't have to take that into account. We know that we create some really cold, hostile spaces, which we're starting to think about, and we know that built form can really be very hostile, damaging pedestrian comfort and damaging vegetation health. I love 20 Fenchurch Street. They have to change the trees there every year because they don't survive. They get blown to pieces. They've got some silver birch up there this year. Maybe they'll do better. Okay, this is what we have, but this is what we do. And so what we're trying to do is increase awareness that we have to start thinking about this and the interdependencies between buildings in their environment. What does it mean? Okay, so we know quite a lot about built form. This is a map of all the buildings in London, and all the black spaces or all the open spaces is by Emu Analytics. They let me use their work. And the various colours tell us about the different heights of buildings, not their form, but how high they are. And we can see we're quite low rise, we've got lots of open space, but as we get into the centre, we're very dense. We know that we can break this down into local climate zones, which will give us various typologies. So if we look at London, we know in the centre there, we've got buildings which are very tall and closely spaced. And as we go out to the outside, we know that there's more space around the outside. We don't have the same issues on the edges of the city as we do have on the in of the city. So this is a project called WUDAP, which I'm working on with my colleague, Dr Gerald Mills from Dublin. This is urban climatology at its best. They're trying to map all the cities in the world into these 10 climate zones, so we can then correlate all the information that we know about urban climatology, the urban climate. When we map that local climate zones against London's urban heat island, we can see that there's some really interesting correlations. For example, we've got this nice open space here, which is, I was only there yesterday, Richmond. We can see, and we all know that, open space, lots of cool air. When we get into the dense urban area, we know we've got a lot of problems, it gets really hot. But what we seem to forget is that during the daytime, air temperatures in the urban environment, particularly in the centre of our city, are actually lower than the surrounding area. And this is often completely misunderstood in the non-urban climate literature. So this is something we're trying to address, something we're trying to change. We run urban climate walks through the city to try and explain this so we can experience it in the flesh. It's so strange with these. Am I doing okay? Yeah. Good. So this is just basic rules of thumb stuff. During the daytime, this is an area outside the built environment, a field, for example, or an airport where we get our weather data from. So this is represented by this dotted line here. During the daytime, air temperatures, you can see, as we're going along this transect through this route. This is we don't have there's a section of it. As we go along here. During the daytime, air temperatures, I'm talking about air temperatures about 2 meters above ground, the urban heat island, the classic urban heat island, air temperatures, not surface temperatures, air temperatures. We find that during the day, air temperatures are more or less the same. They're more or less equal or slightly lower than the non-urban environment. So when we talk about an urban heat island, we're talking about the characteristic warming of the urban area. But that's usually referring to the nighttime air temperatures. At nighttime, the air temperatures in the urban environment are much higher than the area outside the city. And the reason for that is that there's no obstacles and the heat can give itself up to the nighttime sky. There's nothing holding that heat in. While we're in the built-up area, the thing that stops it from heating up so quickly is this thing that stops it from being released at night, and that's the form, the morphology of the city. Not the materials, although they have an impact, but the built form. It's really important. Surface temperatures are always higher because we're usually making a comparison against an open field. So if you have an open field, the air temperatures are going to be quite different to the ones that are in the city. Yet, we use this data to design our regulated heating and cooling loads. So we're using information from outside a city to influence what's going on, how we design our buildings inside the city. And of course, that's going to have an impact on nighttime air temperatures, and one of the reasons why we get so many overheating risks. We need to talk about that. That's not a conversation for today. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. But during the daytime, you don't necessarily have an urban heat island. But during the nighttime, the city temperatures in the middle of the city can either be the same as outside the city, or they can be higher. But it depends on where you take your base temperature from. So if you're using Heathrow, you're going to get a different urban heat island, a different temperature difference than if you were using Gatwick, for example. But the important thing to remember is that temperatures in London are still the same, regardless of what your urban heat island information is telling you. It's true with the daytime as well. Doesn't necessarily mean that London's cooler than the surroundings during the daytime. It's what we need to focus on is these intra-urban climate effects. Okay, very complicated. As an architect, I'm really concerned with a street scale design. So what goes on at that neighbourhood street level? The drivers for this, the drivers for urban climate in the urban area are height-to-width ratio, the amount of solar radiation that can get into the street during the daytime, and the sky view factor, the amount of radiation that can leave the urban area. It's going to be quite different if you're stood over this side of the street or over this side of the street, the amount of heat that's going to come in, the amount of energy that's going to come in. Generally, what happens in an urban canyon is that one side near the building will be slightly warmer, but this all gets mixed around in here, so the air temperatures are usually equal. Anyway, this is a bit of a fast masterclass in this stuff. It's different everywhere. There are no universal relationships, but we know that there are significant relationships based on height-to-width ratio at a global level, and this kind of comes back to the WUDAC project. So what is an urban climate? An urban climate can be seen to start with a single standalone building in a field, but it will cast shadows, it will change wind direction. If the building's occupied, it will require resources and it will produce waste. But when you get into an urban environment, the sum of the parts is not equal to the sum of the whole. But we're still treating it as if it was the sum of the parts, and we need to change that. We need to start thinking about how these built forms are influencing the climate and how that climate's influencing the energy of the buildings. If we have any hope of reaching our targets, we need to think differently. So what are the drivers of built form? In London, we've got the historic footprint, 2,000 years. You can still recognise bits of London through that. We know that we've got infrastructure that weaves its way through that controls our built form, such as Liverpool Street Station is a good example of what's going on there. We know conservation determines what's going on with our form. We know that technology determines what is going on with our form. This is the emerging type of ground scraper that we're seeing to deal with the types of work that people are doing, replacing redundant built forms, such as what's going on at Broadgate, Bishopsgate, Broadgate, Bishopsgate. You know what I mean. You know this building. Okay. And we've got easements, for example, views of St. Paul, really powerful devices costing millions of pounds. That was not a cheap, finicky decision made by Rogers there. It was one to protect the view of St. Paul's, which cost a lot of money. But we don't consider energy. Oh, finance, how much money can I make? I don't like talking about this one. Form, whether it's residential or whether it's residential or non-residential. These buildings are still more or less the same, but they're different. But we're not talking about energy and how energy influences built form. This is my friend Sam, who stood at the bottom of 20 Fenchurch Street after they've done the repair on the facade to stop the reflections. You can see he has a dual shadow, one from the building, one from the sun. The building's form, we know, is a really obvious example, has focused the beam and caused all of these problems. It's also really windy, they have to change the trees, but that curved facade is also probably minimizing the energy, the cooling load that building needs in the first place. So these things are interconnected. We can't pretend that they're not anymore. So, how am I doing? So this is our study area, the City of London, where we've been doing our work, where we've been undertaking a measured survey of various different effects. We're still looking for funding, we're still looking for more equipment, we're still looking for lampposts, things to stick monitors on. So we're trying to set up the City of London as a living lab to try and understand these effects. And why we think that the City of London is so important is because it's right in the middle of the city. Everything that goes on, depending on the weather, is going to pass over it. Yet it gets the blame for loads of things. It's actually cooler there in the daytime than anywhere else. So, I think it's doing pretty well. I'm happy to talk to you all about that on the walk. Come along. Here we are right in the middle of it. We can see that we've got all of these different built forms. There's a load more other stuff going on around at the edges. And so we designed this urban climate walk to go through all these different spaces so we could experience all these different sensations. Actually, they're pretty hardcore, these buildings, and you can really feel it. Even if it's a hot day, it's different to a windy day, but there's always an effect. So we were interested in that group of buildings and what the effects of that are on the local climate. You can see, there it is. I mean, this is a render. You can see around the outside, it's very different to what's going on around the outside. Yet we still treat what's going on in here the same as what's going on there. It doesn't matter what its function is. We still treat all of this stuff the same. We look at daylight, for example. This is using a sky view factor to see how much daylight is actually getting into these, getting into the streets. What is the shadow of these tall buildings? But we can see in the winter, these tall buildings aren't really having any effect on what's going on because it's so dense. So it's not just about tall buildings, but increasing density has an impact on daylight in the streets, which might or might not be acceptable. We're talking about increasing urban density, but we don't really know what the impact of that is going to be on our city and how we're going to live in it. And in the future, as we become short of energy, how are these buildings going to survive? We looked at climate. We measured the daytime air temperatures, and we found, as expected, that during the day, the air temperatures were more or less equal. Didn't matter where you were. We found that, no surprise, that at the base of the tall buildings, Ropemaker Place, the Gherkin, I don't like calling them that name, 30 St Mary's Axe, 122 Leadenhall, 20 Fenchurch Street, we found that there were different wind patterns depending on whether it was the average wind speed or the maximum wind speed. We did lots of other measurements as well, but they're not presented here. We found that these tall buildings have an impact, but what is that? We wanted to investigate that further. When we looked at the air temperatures in the winter and in the summer, these are daytime air temperatures, compared to an inner urban site along Moorgate. We've taken that as our base site. We can see actually there's not much of a range in air temperatures, which we knew. But we can see that the wind speed, compared to Moorgate, around 20 Fenchurch Street, that the wind speed can be 12 plus or minus 13. It's a huge range. But what does that mean? Is that useful? Can we use that for something? Can we make our cities better understanding that? We're putting up all these tall buildings. We don't really know what's going on. So we started measuring this on the impact of these buildings on air quality. What is the role of streets on air quality? So we're using small diffusion tubes spread all over the city. You might see them, little test tubes with red tops on lampposts, measuring NOx, NO2, I can't remember. And we found, surprisingly, in the city that the air quality is really bad. We kind of know that. We found that the worst places were those main routes. So Moorgate and Bishopsgate. But we found that the air quality around the eastern cluster was really good. This is really good. The lower the pink, the better it is. And then the worst place was along Moorgate, but it's surprisingly high. So what was the problem? What was causing that? And we found that there's an overhang at the moment at the traffic lights. A temporary overhang, which has caused the air quality to degrade so badly that you don't want to stop there. These are the other two worst places, Bishopsgate and London Wall. These two. And this is the back. These are the measured monthly and averages from the King's College project. This is the background site. You can see the difference between the background site and what's going on here. This is huge. There's a lot of stuff going on here, more than we've got time to go into today, but these are built form effects, holding pollution in the streets. We looked at more detail along Moorgate and along Bishopsgate, and we know that Bishopsgate has got a lot more traffic going along it. I'm sure we've all walked down there, and yet the air quality there is only slightly worse than what's going on it along Moorgate. And the reason is Moorgate's very, very straight. Height-to-width ratio is about 1, pretty straight road, where Bishopsgate, on the other hand, is going completely crazy. The street changes width, and the buildings change height. Again, when we look at the eastern cluster in more detail, we can see that we've got some really low levels here, just off the road. We know that there are two reasons for this. One is that the traffic levels are low, but also that the buildings are so tall that they're pulling in the fresher, cooler air from above. I'm not saying that tall buildings are good. I'm saying that we don't understand enough about what's going on. We did the verification. This is our verification. We've got CFD modelling around bank and also our measured data, and it matches pretty well. So we're pretty convinced that that we're spot on here. And this is at Bishopsgate. We can find that this angle in the building here at 100 Bishopsgate is actually reducing the levels of pollution at this point. That's a change in the surface. It's creating a downdraft, which is helping the air to become diluted with fresher air at this point. There are 541 tall buildings going up around London at the moment compared to about the 160 that we've got. And we don't really understand what's going on. We don't really understand enough about what's going on in the daytime. We don't really understand about what's going on at nighttime and how these buildings are helping to cool our urban environment, which is going to become increasingly important if we go back to the original slide. So every building has to account. We have to think more about built form. It has to become the prime focus here. We have to get that right, and then all of the other technologies will work better. And this is the next urban climate walking tour. Okay.